a true and particular account of all the linen, the lace, the napery and the hangings of the household of Edenfield Court in the county of Norfolk, taken and written fair this Michaelmas in the year of our Lord 1821, that nothing be lost and nothing be let go to ruin for want of mending. Item, of the great bed in the state chamber, 1 tester and valance of crimson damask, much faded, the fringe to be renewed. Item, of the long gallery, 11 pairs of holland sheets, whole, 9 pairs, mended, 4 pairs, past mending and kept for bands. Item, of the still room and the linen press, 18 dozen of napkins, the diaper and the damask sorted apart. Item, of the lace laid by in the cedar chest against the upper landing, the christening set of Brussels point, the bridal veil of Mechlin, the deep flounces of the old Honiton, all of them counted, all of them sound, all of them entered here and watched over and kept. And then, last upon the page, written in the same small, even hand that had written all the rest, in a line that asked the house for nothing, and was owed by the house nothing in return. Item, of the person who keeps these things, 1 widow, Thomasina Vane, taken in upon the charity of the family, no wage, her board and a garret, and the mending of her own 2 gowns when she can find the hours. She was 28 years of age. She had kept that linen book, and the still-room book, and the book of the poor, and very nearly every other written thing in that house, since she was 21, and newly a widow with a dead husband's debt fastened round her neck like a millstone of which she was somehow expected to be ashamed. And she had written that last line herself, every Michaelmas for 7 years, in her own dead husband's family's house, because no one living had ever once thought to tell her she was anything more than a useful pair of hands that ate. She did not weep when she wrote it. She had taught herself very early that a tear let fall upon fine work spotted the thread, and a spotted thread had to be picked out and set again, and the picking out wasted both the thread and the daylight, and daylight in a Norfolk winter was the one thing in that whole rich house that could not be bought back. So she had taught her grief to wait until the work was off her lap. This is a story about a woman who taught her grief to wait so patiently, and for so many years, that she very nearly came to believe it had given up waiting altogether and gone quietly away. Until a man she had never met, a stranger come into his inheritance in a plain dark coat, took up a small worked thing she had made with her own girl's hands a lifetime before, turned it to the light, read aloud the name that was stitched into it in a thread so fine he did not at first know he was reading anything at all, and in the reading of it set loose, in one slow grey-gold autumn, a thing that had been folded away and pressed flat and kept in lavender for the better part of 30 years. Edenfield Court stood low and long and grey at the bottom of its own park, a great Jacobean house of napped flint and dressed stone with tall twisted chimneys and 100 lozenged windows that took the last of the light and gave none of it back. It had been raised by men who meant to be looked at and had outlived, by 2 centuries, all the looking. Now it was full of things and empty of people. Old Sir Marcus Vane had been the last of his name to live in it as a master, and he had lived in it the way a snail lives in a shell too large for it, gone to the back rooms, the fires lit in only 3 chambers out of 40, the long gallery shut, and the lace in the cedar chest, and the silver under Holland, and the great rooms given over to dust sheets and the slow grey work of moths. He had been a hard, dry, frightened old man, frightened above all of being cheated, and the thing he had been most certain of in the world was that everyone about him meant to cheat him, and the one person about him who never had, never by so much as a farthing or an hour, was the widow of his dead grand-nephew, whom he had taken into the house out of what the neighbourhood was pleased to call his charity, and what was in plain fact the cheapest housekeeper, a frightened miser, ever engaged. Thomasina had come to Edenfield in the spring she was 21. She had been married 11 months. Her husband, Edmund Vane, had been a charming, weak, warm-handed young man with no fortune and large ideas, a distant Vane connection who had courted her out of a Norwich draper's parlour where she sat all day at her cushion, making lace, and who had married her against the wishes of every relation he possessed, and who had then, with great tenderness and no foresight whatever, contrived to die of a putrid fever in a lodging-house in Yarmouth before their first year was out, leaving her with a wedding ring, a box of his unpaid bills, and the particular social position of a poor girl who had married up just far enough to be resented and not nearly far enough to be kept. The Vanes had buried him and looked at her over the grave the way one looks at a bill one did not expect, and old Sir Marcus, who had outlived his own sons and had a great cold house and a horror of paying servants their proper hire, had said, in a tone that was meant to sound like mercy and sounded only like arithmetic, that the girl might as well come to Edenfield and make herself useful with the linen, since she was clever with a needle and had nowhere else on earth to be. So she had come. She had brought with her one trunk, in which were 2 gowns, a Bible that had been her mother's, the tools of her trade, wrapped in a roll of flannel, and, folded in silver paper at the very bottom, under everything else where no one would ever think to look, the one possession in all the world that she could not account for and had never spoken of, a christening cap of point lace made by her own hands when she was a girl of 14 in the Norwich workroom, copied stitch for stitch from a pattern that had come to her she did not know how, a pattern of such surpassing fineness that her own mistress, who had worked lace for 30 years, had set it down and looked at the girl for a long moment and said only, very low, "Where did you have this?" And Thomasina, who had not known then and did not know now, had not been able to say. She set herself to the work of the house, as a drowning creature sets itself to the work of not drowning, with a steadiness that left no room for anything else. She learned where every sheet was, and how worn. She learned the lace in the cedar chest, as a priest learns his breviary, the Brussels and the Mechlin and the old yellowed Honiton, and she mended what could be mended and laid by what could not, and entered all of it, every Michaelmas, in the long book, in the small, even hand that had no flourishes in it because flourishes wasted ink. She kept the still room and the simples and the household reckonings, and within 3 years she was keeping the whole written life of Edenfield Court, the rents and the receipts and the poor book, because old Sir Marcus discovered that the widow never made an error and never asked to be thanked for not making one, and a man who lives in dread of being cheated will give the keys of everything to the one person in whom he can find no fault, and resent them for it ever after. She was not unhappy exactly. She had taught herself not to use the word. She had taught herself, instead, a great repertoire of smaller words that asked for less. She was occupied. She was tired in a way that let her sleep. She was, on the better evenings when the work was off her lap and the one candle was hers and the wind was in the Edenfield chimneys, something that was almost peaceful, the way a field is peaceful in the winter after the harvest is in, and there is nothing more to be wanted of it until the spring, and no spring is expected. She had learned to set her wanting on the far side of a line, the way she set her grief there, and to do her work on this side of the line, where the wanting could not reach it and spoil the thread. And the years had gone by in the great grey house, and the lace had stayed sound in the cedar chest, and the widow had stayed sound at her work, and no one had come to Edenfield who had any reason to look at either of them twice. Until old Sir Marcus, who had been dying by inches for a 12-month and had refused to admit it because dying cost money in physicians, died in earnest on a wet black night in the last week of September, with Thomasina sitting up beside him, because there was no one else who would, and with 2 words on his cracked lips that he said twice, as a man says a thing he has carried too long and can carry no further, and that she did not understand and would not understand for a long while yet, and that she wrote down afterward in the book of her own memory, the way she wrote down everything, exactly and without comment, against the day it might be wanted. He had looked at her in the last hour, with his frightened miser's eyes gone strange and soft and far away, and he had taken her wrist in his cold dry hand with a sudden surprising strength, and he had said a name. It was not her name. It was a woman's name, a soft, old-fashioned name, and he said it the way a man says a thing he has been forbidden to say, half a question and half a confession. And then he said a second word after it, lower still, and the second word was sorry. And then he had let go of her wrist, and turned his face to the wall, and died. And Thomasina had sat very still in the cold and the candlelight with her own grief, obediently waiting on the far side of its line, and had thought, with the part of her mind that was always counting, that there would be a great deal to do, and that there was no one but herself to do it, and that whatever was coming to Edenfield Court now was coming to a house in which she had no place, and no name, and no claim, and that the sensible thing, the only thing, was to set the house in such perfect order that when the new master came, he would have no fault to find, and to ask of him only what a useful widow might decently ask, a fortnight's grace and a character, and then to take the mail coach south and disappear as quietly as she had come into whatever small grey life would have her. For Edenfield was not hers, and never had been. It would pass, she knew, by the strict and ancient settlement of the Vane estate, entire and unbroken, to the nearest male of the blood, and the nearest male of the blood was a person she had never met and scarcely heard named, a great-nephew of old Sir Marcus, by a line that had quarrelled with the Edenfield Vanes 2 generations back and gone off into the navy and the wider world, a man who had inherited, somewhere in the late wars, a separate and grander title from his mother's people, and was now, she understood, to be addressed as the Earl of Harrowgate. He was coming to take possession. The Norwich attorney had written it out in a fair clerk's hand, and the words had sat on the page in front of her like a sentence, that his lordship, the Earl of Harrowgate, would arrive at Edenfield Court upon the 1st of October, to take possession of the house and the lands and of everything that was in the house. Everything that was in the house. She had read the phrase 3 times. It was a lawyer's phrase, meaning nothing, meaning the napery and the silver and the lace in the cedar chest and the dust sheets and the moths, and yet it made no room in it, that phrase, for a living woman who was also, in the strict and friendless sense, a thing that was in the house, taken in upon charity, no wage, her board and a garret. And Thomasina, reading it, had felt the old, cold, sensible clarity settle over her, like the Holland over the silver, and had understood that she must be gone, or as good as gone, before the phrase came walking up the avenue in a pair of boots, and found her there, among the things it had come to count. She gave herself the few days that were left. She had old Sir Marcus carried to the church, and laid by his sons under the Vanestone, with the 4 servants who remained, and the parson and herself, the only mourners. And she came back, and she began, with the terrible thoroughness of a woman saying goodbye to the only home she had, to put Edenfield Court in order for a man who did not know she existed. She had the dust sheets off and beaten and back on fresh. She had the 3 lived-in chambers turned out and the great state-rooms aired. She went through the linen book line by line against the presses, so that the new master, if ever he chose to look, would find that not one napkin had gone astray on the widow's watch. And on the last night before he came, the last night that Edenfield Court was, in any sense she could bear to name, in her own keeping, She went up to the cold garret under the eaves that had been her room for 7 years, and she lit her one Aloud candle, and she took out her trunk, and she did the thing she always did when a chapter of her life was closing, and she needed to know, exactly and without comment, what she had to carry into the next. She took an inventory of herself. 2 gowns, grey, the one mended at the elbow, a mother's Bible, the cover gone soft as cloth with handling, the roll of flannel with her lace tools in it, the bobbins and the pins and the pricked parchment patterns, worth more to her than anything else she owned because it was the means by which she could, anywhere on God's earth, sit down and make something out of nothing and be paid a little for it. £11, 4 shillings and 2 pence, in a knotted stocking, saved over 7 years a farthing at a time, bought only against this exact night, against the price of a coach south and a fortnight's lodging and the first month while she found a place. And then, last, from the very bottom, from under everything, wrapped in its silver paper, gone soft and creased with 30 years of folding and unfolding, the christening cap of point lace that she had made when she was 14 and had never been able to explain. She unwrapped it now in the candlelight and laid it across her 2 open palms and looked at it the way she had looked at it 100 times before, as though looking might at last make it speak. It was very small and very fine, the lace of it so close and so even that it seemed less made than grown, like frost on a window, and it had cost her, that single small thing, the better part of a Norwich winter, the labour of love and obsession that a 14-year-old girl pours into the one beautiful thing she will make before the work of the world grinds the beauty out of her, and worked into the band of it, so fine that you could pass it by 100 times and see only ornament, was a pattern that was not quite a pattern, a curl and a knot, and a small repeated device that she had copied without understanding from the parchment that had come to her. She knew, not how, and that she had never, in 14 years of turning it to the light, been able to read. She did not know it was her name. She did not know it was anyone's name. She only knew that it was hers, and that it was the one thing in all her careful accounted life for which she had never been able to write the line of explanation, and that tomorrow a stranger would come into the house and she would carry this small, mute, uncountable thing away with her into the south and the dark, and no one in the world would ever know it had been there at all. She folded it again in its silver paper. She put it back at the bottom of the trunk, under the Bible and the gowns and the £11, where it had lain so long. She blew out the candle to save it, and she lay down in the cold in her clothes, and she set her grief, as she had set it every night for 7 years, on the far side of its patient line, and she waited, dry-eyed and orderly and ready, for the morning that would bring the Earl of Harrogate up the avenue to take possession of everything that was in the house. He came at the middle of the day, on the 1st of October, in a hired chaise with no arms painted on the doors, which she had not expected. She had expected a great lacquered travelling coach with a coronet on the panels and outriders, the way the dead old man had always feared and described the coming of any heir. And instead there was only a plain, mud-spattered chaise drawn up on the wet gravel of the sweep, and a single grave grey-haired man in a sober coat, handing down a black despatch box, and behind him, stepping down stiffly and without haste, favouring his right leg in a way he plainly disliked anyone to notice, a tall man in a plain dark coat, who stood for a moment in the thin October sun and looked up at the long grey front of Edenfield Court with a face that gave nothing away. Thomasina watched him from the shadow of the screen's passage, where she had drawn up the 4 remaining servants in their best, in a ragged line in the cold flagged hall, the old butler Pell and the cook and the 2 maids, because somebody had had to think of it, and there was no one but her to think of anything. She had a moment, before he came in, to look at him, and what she saw did not fit any of the pictures she had made. He was perhaps 35. He was lean and hard-used in the way of men who have been a long time at sea and a long time hurt, with dark hair cut close and going grey at the temples sooner than his years asked, and a clean-shaven, weathered face that was all straight lines and stillness, and a long pale seam of an old scar running back along the left side of his jaw into the hair, the kind of mark that a splinter of ship's timber leaves when a ball comes through the side. He did not look cruel. She had braced herself for cruel, or for careless, or for the kind of large, loud heartiness that is worse than either, and instead there was only a great, closed quietness about him, a stillness held so deliberately that she understood, with the quick, unsought reading of faces that was her one ungovernable gift, that it was not coldness at all, but the most careful kind of restraint, the stillness of a man who has learned that he must hold himself very level because the things underneath are not level at all. He came into the hall out of the bright doorway into the grey, and his boot heels were loud on the flags, and the 4 servants made their bows and their bobs, and the grave grey solicitor murmured at his elbow, "My lord." The household and the Earl of Harrogate walked slowly down the short line of them with his hat in his hand, and looked at each face in turn, gravely and without a word, the way she imagined he might once have walked the line of a ship's company, taking the measure of what he had been given to command. And then he came to the end of the line, where the servants ended, and there was Thomasina, standing a little apart in her mended grey gown, with her hands folded and her chestnut hair pinned plainly and severely back without a loose strand, her composed oval face turned up to him with all feeling filed out of it, and her grey eyes giving away precisely nothing. And she did not fit the line of servants, and she did not fit anything else. And he stopped. He stopped, and he looked at her, and a small line came between his brows, the look of a man who has been handed an account that does not balance, an item he cannot place. He looked at her gown, which was a lady's gown grown old, and at her hands, which were a working woman's hands, and he looked for a moment longer than was comfortable at her face, which was the face of a gentlewoman who has decided to stop being one. "And this lady," he said. It was not quite a question. His voice was low and level and rather worn, a voice that had spent years pitching itself to be heard over weather, and now pitched itself deliberately under it. The grey solicitor opened his mouth, and Thomasina, who had had 7 years' practice at sparing other people the trouble of explaining her, spoke first, quietly, and saved them all. "I keep the linen, my lord," she said, "and the household books. I was married to a connection of the family. Sir Marcus was good enough to give me my board here, in exchange for the keeping of things. I have set the house in order against your coming, and the books are made up to the day, and I shall not trouble your lordship beyond the time it takes to show your people where everything is." She had meant it to close the matter. She had pitched it exactly, useful, finished, departing, asking nothing. She watched it land on him, and she watched, with that same unwanted clarity, that it did not close the matter at all. He looked at her for a moment longer. Something moved behind the stillness of his face, some small recalibration, the look of a man who has been told a sum and has begun, quietly, to suspect that the sum is wrong. "You keep the linen," he repeated in a tone she could not read, and she understood that he had heard, under the smooth, closed sentence she had given him, all the things she had folded out of it, a connection of the family, given her board, no wage spoken, a lady's gown gone grey. He did not say any of that. He inclined his head a very little, a precise, small acknowledgement, the courtesy of a man to a person he has not yet decided how to weigh. "Thank you," he said. "I am obliged to you for the order of the house. We will speak of the rest." And he passed on into the cold rooms of Eden Field with his solicitor at his heel, and left her standing in the hall with the 4 servants, and the phrase he had used hanging in the air behind him like a thread left dangling from a hem. We will speak of the rest. She had not wanted there to be a rest. The rest was the whole of the danger. The rest was the part of her that she had spent 7 years teaching, to wait quietly on the far side of its line, and she did not at all care to have a stranger in a plain coat go reaching toward that line on the very first hour of the first day, with a look on his level, scarred face, as though he meant to read her account to the bottom and find out where it did not balance. She told herself it meant nothing. So she told herself that a man newly come into a great, cold, inconvenient house naturally wished to know who the odd grey woman in it was and what was to be done with her, and that the doing with her would be exactly what she had planned for it to be, a fortnight's grace and a character, and the mail coach south, and that his, we will speak of the rest, meant only the settling of that, the small, tidy, administrative end of a useful widow no longer wanted. She believed almost none of this, and she went about the work of the next days as though she believed all of it. The house woke up around the new master, a little, the way a house does. The Earl of Harrogate was not a man who filled a house with noise. He had brought no great train, only the grey solicitor, whose name was Mr. Quennell, and who had served the Harrogate title for 30 years, and a single silent manservant, and the rest he left to the household that was there, which meant that he left it, in effect, to Thomasina, since the household that was there had run for 7 years upon Thomasina and knew no other way to run. And so she found, to her dismay, that she could not simply withdraw into a corner and wait out her fortnight. The new master, having no notion where anything was, or how anything was done, asked, and the servants, having no notion either, sent him to her. And within 2 days she was once again, against all her resolutions, the hand that kept Edenfield going, walking the Earl of Harrogate through his own inheritance because there was no one else alive who knew it. She showed him the house. She did it as flatly and as briefly as she could, walking a careful pace ahead of him with her hands folded, naming the rooms, the state chamber with its faded crimson bed, the long gallery with the painted dead veins looking down, the muniment room over the old buttery where the deeds and the deed boxes were, the still room with its hanging herbs and its labelled jars, the linen presses, the plate room. He followed her without comment, his stick tapping, his bad leg slowing him on the stairs in a way she pretended not to see. And he looked at everything with the same grave attention he had turned on the servants' faces, as though everything in the house were a thing he must learn before he could be trusted to command it. He asked few questions, and the questions he asked were not the ones she had braced for. He did not ask what anything was worth. Old Sir Marcus had asked what everything was worth, always, first and last. It had been the only question the old man had. The Earl of Harrogate asked instead who had mended a thing, and how long it had taken, and whether it had been hard, and once, in the long gallery, standing before a great old tapestry of a hunt, gone soft and silver with age, where she had spent the better part of 2 winters reweaving a rotted corner thread by thread to match the old wool. He stood for a long time without speaking, and then he said, not turning his head, "You did this." It was not a question either. She said that she had. He said, "How long?" She told him, 2 winters. He was quiet again. Then he said in his low, worn, level voice, the thing that she would turn over in her mind for a long time afterward, the first crack in the smooth, closed surface of the days. "When I was a boy," he said, "I was told that the people who kept the things in great houses were the thing's servants. I have begun to think it is the other way about. I think the things are kept alive by the people, and the people are not thanked, because a house cannot say thank you, and the people who own the house forget that they are not the house." And he moved on down the gallery with his stick tapping, and did not look to see what she made of it, and she stood for a moment in front of the silver hunt, with her careful, filed flat face, doing something she had not given it leave to do. And then she folded her hands and followed him, and said nothing, because there was nothing safe to say. The grief on the far side of the line stirred a little, the way a sleeper stirs at a sound, and she pressed it back down and went on naming the rooms. On the third evening, Mr. Quennell, the grey solicitor, asked to see the books. This she had been waiting for. This was proper. This was the part she knew how to do. She brought them down to the muniment room and laid them out on the wide deal table by the light of a branch of candles, the rent book and the receipt book and the poor book and the great long linen book, all of them in her small, even, unflourished hand, all of them made up to the day. All of them she knew without vanity because it was simply a fact, faultless. And she stood back with her hands folded while the old solicitor went down them, and she watched his grey eyebrows go up, slowly, page after page, and she felt the small, grim private satisfaction of the cheapest housekeeper a frightened miser ever engaged, who had been worth, every quarter for 7 years, 10 times what she was paid, which was nothing. Mr. Quennell turned the last page of the linen book and took off his spectacles and looked at her over them for a moment, and then he said to the Earl, who had come quietly into the room and was standing in the shadow by the door with his stick, "My lord, I have been 35 years among great men's accounts, and I have never in my life seen a household kept as these are kept. There is not a farthing astray. There is not an erasure. There is not a single thing in this house, my lord, that is not written down here and watched over and accounted for." And he put his spectacles back on and looked down again at the long, even columns, and he said, half to himself, in a tone of professional wonder that he did not at all intend as the cruelty it was, "Every last thing in the house is in this book." And the Earl of Harrogate, standing in the shadow by the door, said in his low, level voice, looking not at the book, but at the woman who stood beside it with her hands folded and her face gone very still, "Is she?" There was a small silence in the muniment room. The candles guttered. "Mr." Quennell looked up, not understanding, and said, "My lord." And the Earl came forward a step into the candlelight and laid one scarred finger on the open page of the linen book, near the bottom, where the last line of all was written in the same small, even hand as everything above it, and he read it. He read it aloud, slowly, the way a man reads a line he has just that moment found and does not yet understand, in the level, uninflected voice of a man reading an inventory. And so he read it, without meaning to, in the only way it had ever truly been meant to be read, as though the thing it named were a person, and not the last item in a list. "Item," he read, "of the person who keeps these things. One widow, Thomasina Vane, taken in upon the charity of the family, no wage, her board and a garret and the mending of her own 2 gowns when she can find the hours." He stopped. He took his finger off the page. He looked up, and across the wide deal table in the guttering candlelight he looked at her. And the small line had come again between his brows, deeper now, and his level voice when it came was very quiet. "You wrote this," he said. "You wrote yourself," he said, "into the linen book, between the napkins and the lace, in your own hand, no wage." And Thomasina Vane stood very straight on the far side of the table, with her hands folded and her grief stirring hard now against its line, and she heard the thing in her own account read aloud for the first time in 7 years by a voice that did not understand it, and she found that she could not, for the length of 3 full breaths, say anything at all. When at last she could speak, she gave him the answer she had given the world for 7 years, the answer that asked for nothing and explained everything away. "It is only the truth, my lord," she said. "I keep the things. I am a thing that is kept. It is honest to write it where it belongs. I had no wish to be flattered in a household book. She meant it to end there. She had a great gift for ending things there. But the Earl of Harrogate did not let it end there, and she saw, with the cold clarity that never left her, that he was not a man who let things end before the end, that he was, in some deep, wounded, patient way, exactly the wrong man for a woman who lived by leaving things unfinished, because he was a man who read everything, every account and every face and every line of patient ink, all the way down to the bottom of the page, and then turned the page over to see if there was anything written on the back. No, he said. He said it gently, but he said it the way a man closes a door. It is not the truth. It is an arrangement that an old, frightened man made with a young, friendless woman. And you have kept it so faithfully that you have begun to mistake it for a fact. They are not the same thing. And he closed the linen book, carefully, and put his scarred hand flat on the cover of it for a moment, as though swearing on it, and he said, "I should like to know how a gentlewoman comes to be written into a linen book between the napkins and the lace. I should like to know it before I know anything else about this house. Mr. Quennell, we will let the rents wait." Thomasina felt the floor of her careful life tilt very slightly beneath her, the way the deck of a ship must tilt under a man who has lived on land, a movement small enough to deny and large enough to make the heart stand still. She had planned a fortnight. She had planned a character and the mail coach south. She had not planned to be a question that a grave, determined man meant to answer. "My lord," she said, and she heard her own voice come out level and reasonable and quite steady, which was the only thing she had left that was entirely hers. "There is nothing to know. I was a Norwich tradesman's daughter who made lace. I married above myself unwisely, and was widowed and was taken in here. It is the commonest story in England. There is no mystery in it but the ordinary mystery of a woman with no money. I beg you will not trouble yourself, or me. I shall be gone within the fortnight, and the house will run perfectly well without me, for I have written down everything that need be known." It was the longest speech she had made to him, and it was a mistake, and she knew it was a mistake even as she made it, because a woman who truly had nothing to hide does not take such pains to close the lid. And she watched the Earl of Harrogate listen to her with his grave, still attention, and she watched him hear, under the smooth, reasonable surface of it, the thing she had not meant to let show, which was fear. He heard the fear. She saw him hear it. A woman who is merely poor does not beg to be left unexamined. A woman who is merely poor has nothing to lose by being looked at. And the Earl's level, scarred face changed, very slightly, in a way she could not at first read, and then she understood, with a kind of despair, that what had come into it was not suspicion at all. It was tenderness, held very carefully level. It was the look of a man who has just realized that the closed door he is standing at is not locked against him to keep a secret in, but to keep a wound from being touched. "I will not trouble you," he said slowly. "But I will not let you go in a fortnight either, into the south and the dark, with a stocking of saved farthings and 2 grey gowns, on the strength of an arrangement that a dead man made for his own convenience. That I will not do. I have spent 15 years, he said, and for the first time something old and bitter moved in the worn level voice. Watching men be thrown away because it was convenient to somebody that they should be thrown away, and called it the common story, and the commonest story in England. I have buried more of them than I can count. I find I have no more patience left in me for the throwing away of people. You will stay until I understand you. After that you shall go where you please, and I will give you the means to go there as a lady and not as a parcel. But you will not vanish out of this house in a fortnight as though you had never been in it. that is all I ask." And there was nothing in it she could fight, because there was nothing in it that was not kind, and kindness was the one assault for which 7 years had left her wholly without a defence. She inclined her head, because she could not trust her voice, and she gathered up the books, and she went out of the muniment room with her grief beating now against its line like a bird against a window, and she went up to the cold garret, and she sat on the edge of the bed in the dark without lighting the candle, and she did not weep, because she had forgotten how. But she sat for a long time, with her hands pressed flat to her own face, feeling the shape of it under her fingers, as though to be sure it was still there. He set about understanding her the way she imagined he had once set about understanding a strange coast, methodically, without fuss, missing nothing. He began with old Pell, the butler, who had been at Edenfield since he was a boy, and had known the house in the days when it was full. The Earl had him into the small warm parlour where a fire was now kept, and gave him a glass of the old man's own pantry sherry, and sat with him an hour, and Thomasina, who was not present, learned of it afterward only because old Pell came to her in the still room that evening with his face working and his hands trembling, and could not for a while say what was the matter, and at last got out that his lordship had asked him about the year the spring she came, and before that, and about the old master's brother, and he, Pell, had told what little he knew, which he had never told a living soul, because the old master had forbidden it on pain of dismissal, and Pell had a long memory and a faithful heart, and had held his tongue for 30 years. And now the old master was dead, and the new master had asked him plain and looked at him kind, and it had come out of him like water out of a cracked jug, and he was sorry, Mrs. Vane. He was sorry. He hoped he had done no harm. And Thomasina, going very still over the warm pan of resin she was melting, asked him, in a voice she kept low and even by an effort that cost her everything, what it was he had told. And old Pell, wretched and relieved at once, told her. There had been, he said, a brother. Old Sir Marcus had had a younger brother, Mr. Hugh Vane, dead these 30 years and more, a wild, handsome, unsteady man, the family grief, who had gone off to London and lived high and married. It was whispered, secretly and beneath himself, or above himself, no one rightly knew, a marriage the family would not own, and who had died young and poor and in disgrace, and whose name had not been spoken at Edenfield in Pell's hearing since before the present century turned. And there had been, Pell said, his old voice dropping, the spring of the year 93 or thereabouts, a thing he had never understood and never asked about, because at Edenfield you did not ask, a closed carriage in the night, and a bundle carried in, and a woman, a nurse or a servant, kept 3 days in the blue room and then sent away with money. And after that there had been an infant in the house, a girl, very quiet, kept in the care of a country woman in the village and never spoken of at the great house, and the old master had paid for her keep through a Norwich agent and forbidden any to ask whose she was, and when she was grown a little, she had been bound apprentice to the lace in Norwich, with her fees paid by the same close agent, and after that Pell had lost sight of her, the way a servant loses sight of a thing that is taken out of the house, and he had thought of her only once or twice, in all the years since, and had never once thought to connect that quiet, hidden village child with the grave grey widow who came to keep the linen, until his lordship's questions tonight had laid the 2 ends of the thread, suddenly and dreadfully in his 2 hands at once, and he had seen, only as he was speaking it aloud, where the thread ran. Thomasina took the resin off the fire. She did it carefully, because resin left on the fire burns, and a thing once learned in her hands did not unlearn itself even now. She set it on the cold slab. She put her 2 hands flat on the scrubbed deal table, and she looked at the grain of the wood, and she made old Pell say it all again, slowly, the carriage and the bundle and the village woman and the close Norwich agent who paid the fees, and she fitted it, item by item, against the things she had carried all her life and never been able to enter in any book, that she had no memory of a mother, and only the haziest of a kind, hard country woman who was not her mother, that her fees at the Lace had been paid by a lawyer she never saw, that she had come into the world, as far as any paper she had ever held could prove, from nowhere at all, a girl without a christening she could point to, a parish foundling in everything but the parish. And the one thing she owned that contradicted all of it, the one impossible thing, the small fine christening cap of point lace, folded in silver paper at the bottom of her trunk, that a foundling's hands could never have come by, and that her own girl's hands had nonetheless made, copying a pattern that had come to her, she knew not how. She did not say any of this to Pell. She thanked him, in her even voice, and told him he had done no harm, and sent him to his bed. And when he was gone, she sat alone in the cold still room, among the hanging herbs and the labelled jars with the one candle, and she let herself, for the first time in many years, look directly at the line on the far side of which she kept her wanting, and she found that the thing waiting there was not grief at all, or not only grief, it was hope, and hope, she understood, sitting very still in the herb-scented dark, was a far more dangerous thing to have let wake than grief had ever been, because grief asks nothing of the future, and hope asks everything. And she had built her whole life on asking the future for nothing. And if she let herself believe, even for one night, even on the strength of a trembling old man's 30-year-old memory, that she was the hidden daughter of the vain name and not a foundling kept on charity, and if it then proved false, as such things always proved false for women like her, it would not be a disappointment. It would be a death. So she folded the hope up small, the way she folded the lace, and she put it back under everything, and she resolved, with the last of her cold sense, to say nothing to anyone, to claim nothing, to want nothing, to let the Earl of Harrogate make what inquiries his kindness drove him to make, and to be ready, when they came to nothing, to take her stocking of farthings and her 2 grey gowns and go south as she had always meant to, with her one secret unspoken, and her wound, at least, untouched. It was a good resolution. It lasted until the 2nd week of October, when the first carriage she had dreaded came up the avenue after all, not the heir's plain chaise, but a smart hired post-chaise with a great deal of luggage, carrying a stranger she had never seen, a stout, glossy, comfortable-looking man of about 50 with a large, soft, agreeable face and small, quick, dark eyes and thinning, oiled hair, who came into the cold hall of Edenfield Court, rubbing his plump hands and smiling at everyone and at nothing, and who announced himself, in a warm, confidential voice that filled the hall the way the Earl's quiet one never did, as Mr. Septimus Caudle, attorney at law, lately of Lincoln's Inn, come on a sad errand and a delicate one in the matter of the late Sir Marcus Vane's estate, on behalf of a client whose claim he was very much afraid his lordship the Earl of Harrogate would find it most inconvenient to hear, but hear it his lordship must, for the law was the law, and there were, Mr. Caudle said, smiling all round and laying one finger alongside his soft nose, certain papers, and there were certain irregularities, and there was, he was sorry to say, a question, a most painful question, touching a person presently resident in the house, a person he understood, of no known parentage and no settled name, who had been very cleverly placed here, oh, very cleverly, years ago, against just such a day as this, and he should be glad, when his lordship was at leisure, to lay the whole sad business before him, in confidence, in the interests of all parties, and above all in the interests of sparing the noble family of Vane, a scandal that would otherwise, he feared, run through every drawing-room from Norfolk to London before the spring. and he smiled, and he bowed, and he asked very civilly whether there was a fire anywhere in this magnificent cold barn of a house at which a poor travelling lawyer might warm his hands, and Thomasina, crossing the far end of the hall with a letter-book in her arms, going very quietly and very fast, felt his small, quick, dark eyes find her and follow her the whole length of the cold stone passage, weighing her, pricing her, the way old Sir Marcus had priced everything, and knew, with the sick certainty of a woman who has spent her life reading faces, that the painful question Mr. Septimus Caudle had come all the way from Lincoln's Inn to ask was her. Mr. Caudle laid his sad business before the Earl that same evening in the small warm parlour, over the Earl's own wine, and Thomasina was not in the room, but she heard the shape of what was said the next morning from Mr. Quennell, who told her in his dry, grey, honest way, because he judged rightly that she had a better right to know it than anyone, and because the old solicitor had taken, in his careful fashion, a sort of fierce, protective fondness to the widow whose books were the only flawless thing he had met in 35 years. Mr. Caudle's client, it appeared, was a gentleman named Mr. Roderick Vane, a person hitherto unheard of, who claimed to be the son of that same disgraced younger brother Hugh, the family grief, who had died young and poor in London. And Mr. Roderick Vane claimed, through Mr. Caudle, that his father Hugh had left a private settlement, a paper by which some portion of the Edenfield estate was charged to Hugh's heirs, and that he, Roderick, was that heir, and that the estate the Earl of Harrogate had just walked into was therefore not the Earl's clean and entire, but encumbered and disputed, and worth a great deal of trouble to quiet. And then, Mr. Quennell said, his dry voice going carefully flat, Mr. Caudle had played the second half of his hand, which was the cleverer and the crueler half. He had said that he understood there was living in the house a woman of obscure birth who had been placed here years ago by the late Sir Marcus through a close agent, and he had hinted, oh, very delicately, never quite saying it, that this woman was an impostor, got up against this very day, a base-born creature schooled to pass herself off, when the moment came, as some hidden child of the Vane blood, so as to put in a false claim and bleed the estate. And that his client, Mr. Roderick Vane, being the true and only heir of Hugh, was naturally most anxious that no such fraud should be permitted to muddy the honourable waters, and that the kindest course for all, and the one that would spare the noble Earl a world of scandal, would be for his lordship to settle quietly with the true heir, Mr. Roderick, and to have the impostor woman removed from the house at once, before she could do further mischief. It was, Mr. Quennell said, taking off his spectacles and pinching the bridge of his nose, a thing he had seen done before, and done well. The man Caudle had taken the one true, dangerous fact in the case, that there was indeed a hidden child placed in the house, and had turned it inside out, so that the very truth that might prove her became the proof against her. For if she were Hugh's hidden daughter, then she was the obstacle to Roderick's claim, and must be cried down as a fraud. And if she let herself be cried down and crept away, then the field was clear, and Roderick walked in. "He has been very thorough, my lord," Mr. Quennell had said to the Earl the night before, "and very clever, and I do not yet know how much of what he says is true, and how much is built, but I will tell your lordship one thing for nothing. A man who comes the very week you take possession, with his story already polished, and his slander already aimed at the one person in the house who cannot defend herself, is not a man who has just discovered a grievance. He is a man who has been waiting, with everything ready, for the old master to die." And the Earl of Harrogate had been quiet a long while, Mr. Quennell said, looking into the fire. And then he had said, in his low level voice, only one thing. But Mr. Quennell repeated it to Thomasina word for word, because he thought she should have it, and because it was the kind of thing a dry old lawyer carries away and keeps. then we will not give him the one thing he is waiting for. We will not remove her." Thomasina heard this standing in the cold corridor outside the muniment room with the morning light grey on the panelling, and she put one hand flat against the dark wood and shut her eyes, and she stood so for a moment, steadying herself, because the thing the Earl had said was the most frightening thing anyone had said yet. It was easy to be thrown away. She had built her whole self around the ease of being thrown away. But to be kept, to be defended, to be the one person the master of the house would not remove, though removing her would buy him peace. This was a weight she did not know how to carry, and it pressed on the old wound exactly where the wound was, and she understood that the Earl of Harrogate, in defending her, had without in the least meaning to become the most dangerous man she had ever known, because he was going to make her hope, and he was going to do it kindly, and she had no armour anywhere against being hoped into. She went to him that morning and tried once to do the sensible thing. She found him in the muniment room with Mr. Quennell and the deed boxes, and she stood in the doorway in her grey gown with her hands folded, and she said, very level and very clear, "My lord, I have heard what Mr. Caudle says of me, and I will make it simple for your lordship. Let me go. I make no claim. I have never made a claim, and I never shall. If I am gone, his story has no object, and the scandal he threatens has no person to fasten on, and your lordship's title is clean. I am nothing to this house, and I ask to be allowed to be nothing somewhere else. It is the cheapest and the cleanest way, and your lordship is a man who likes an account to balance. Let me balance it. Let me go." And the Earl of Harrogate looked up at her from the deed box, and for a moment the careful level stillness of his face broke clean open, and she saw what was under it, and what was under it was not pity and not duty, but something steadier and far more frightening, a kind of grave-settled anger on her behalf that she had never in her life had spent on her by anyone. And he stood up, stiffly, favouring the leg, and he came around the table to her, and he said, "Lo, do you know what you are asking me to do? You are asking me to let a man I have never met, with a polished lie and a hired tongue, decide that you do not exist, and to call it tidy. I have been the thing that was tidied away, Mrs. Vane. I was the younger son of a younger son, sent to sea at 13 because I was inconvenient and cheap to be rid of, and I learned at 13 exactly what it is worth to a comfortable man to have an inconvenient person quietly gone. I will not do it to you. I do not care if it is the cheapest way. There are accounts that are not meant to balance by subtraction." And then, because he had said more than he ever said, and the saying of it had cost him, he stepped back and got his level stillness back over his face like a man hauling a tarpaulin over a gun, and he said, in his ordinary worn, quiet voice, "You will oblige me by staying. And you will oblige me further, since you know this house and its papers better than any soul alive, by helping Mr. Quennell and me find out what is true. For I mean to find out what is true, Mrs. Vane, whichever way it cuts. If you are a fraud, I will know it, and you have nothing to fear from my knowing it, for I do not think you are. And if you are Hugh Vane's hidden daughter, I will know that too. And then by God this house will own you, living, in a way it would not own you these 28 years. Either way, the truth. Will you help me find it?" And Thomasina Vane, who had meant to refuse, who had every cold good reason in the world to refuse, looked at the grave scarred face of the man who would not let her be tidied away, and heard the thing she had spent her life forbidding herself to want offered to her plainly as a piece of work to be done. The truth, found and entered and accounted for, which was the one kind of thing she knew in her bones how to do. And she found that she could not refuse it, because it was disguised as a task, and a task was the one form in which she could accept anything. And she said, after a long moment, in a voice that was almost steady, "Yes, my lord, I will help you find it. And so began the strange grey-gold weeks that she would remember, ever afterward, as the time she came back to life, without noticing she was doing it, the way feeling comes back into a frozen hand, first as numbness, and then as pain, and then, at last, as warmth. By day she worked with Mr. Quennell through the muniment room, the two of them taking down the deed boxes one by one and going through the old, close-written papers of the Vane estate, the leases and the settlements and the dreckonings, looking for any trace of the brother Hugh, any paper that owned him or disowned him, any thread that ran to the hidden child. It was work she was made for, patient and exact and endless, and she was better at it than the old lawyer, because she had the whole written life of the house already in her head, and she could say, "This hand is the steward's of the year 4. This is the old master's own. This paper was folded by someone in a hurry. This sale was broken and repressed," and Mr. Quennell, watching her read a document the way he read it himself, but faster and surer, said to her once dryly, that it was the greatest waste in the kingdom that the law did not take women, for she would have made the finest conveyancer in England, and Thomasina, surprising herself, had very nearly smiled. And by evening, when the light failed and the papers had to be put up, there was the other thing, the thing she had no name for and did not dare to name, which was that the Earl of Harrogate had taken to having her read to him. It had begun by accident, or what he let her believe was accident. His eyes, it seemed, had been hurt along with the rest of him in whatever sea fight had marked his jaw and lamed his leg, and they tired and ached by candlelight and would not let him read of an evening as he wished to. And one night, finding her crossing the hall with her arms full of the linen book, he had asked her gruffly, almost ashamedly, whether she would object very much to reading aloud to him an hour, since she had a quiet voice and he had a book he could not finish. And she had said, because she could think of no decent way to refuse her master, that she would not object. And so it had become, without either of them ever once calling it what it was, a thing that happened. Each evening, in the worn south library where a fire was kept and a branch of candles burned, with one of the maids set to her sewing in the corner for propriety's sake, because the Earl was scrupulous about that, scrupulous to the point of pain, Thomasina sat at the far corner of the long table and read aloud to the Earl of Harrogate out of whatever book he set before her. History and voyages, and once, to her private alarm, poetry. And he sat with his bad leg propped and his eyes closed and his scarred hands still on the chair arms, listening, the firelight grave on his level face. And she read in her quiet, even unflourished voice, the way she wrote, without ornament, and somewhere in the second week she noticed that he was not always listening to the book. Sometimes when she glanced up at the turn of a page, she found that his eyes had opened and that he was looking, not at her exactly, but at the fact of her, at the impossible, quiet, ordinary miracle of a woman sitting at his fire, reading to him in a steady voice as though such warmth were a thing that happened to men like them. And the look on his face was the look of a man who has been cold so long that he does not quite trust the fire, and keeps testing it with the back of his hand. And she would drop her eyes back to the page and read on, and her own heart would be going hard and quiet under the grey wool, and the line on the far side of which she kept her wanting would have moved. She would find a little nearer, so that she had to read the harder and the steadier to keep on the safe side of it. They never spoke of it. They spoke, instead, of the book and of the still room, where he had taken to coming of an afternoon to sit on a hard stool by the window with his stick across his knees and watch her grind her resins and warm her oils and make up the simples of the house, asking his grave few questions. How do you know the heat is right? What is this one for? Who taught you? And she would answer and he would nod, and the old housekeeping rhythm of the place wove itself somehow around the two of them and the watching maid, and it was, though neither of them would have dared to say so, very nearly happiness of a thin, grey, careful kind, like winter sun. And all the while, underneath, the search went on, and the danger went on, for Mr. Septimus Caudle had not gone away. He had taken lodgings at the inn in the village, and he came up to the house every few days, smiling and confidential, to press his client's claim, and to drop, each time, a little more poison about the impostor woman, growing bolder as the Earl's patience with him grew colder. And Thomasina knew, in the steady counting part of her mind, that the thin, grey, careful happiness of the library and the still room was a thing borrowed against a debt that must soon be called, and that somewhere in the close written papers of Edenfield Court there lay, if it lay anywhere, the one document that would settle which way the whole matter cut. And so, when the search by daylight with Mr. Quennell had gone through every deed box in the muniment room and found much that was sad and nothing that was proof, she did the thing that only she could do, the thing that came of 7 years of knowing the house better than its own master, and she went, alone, one cold night with a single candle, up the narrow stone stair to the unheated muniment loft over the old buttery, where the truly dead papers were, the ones too old and too forgotten to keep in boxes, the bundled leases of farms long since sold and the letter books of stewards long since dead, because she had remembered, lying awake, that there was up there an old iron-bound chest that no one had opened in her time, that old Sir Marcus had once, years ago, told her sharply to leave alone when she had asked about it, in the only flash of real fear she had ever seen the miser show over anything that was not money. And a frightened man, she had learned, keeps the thing he is most frightened of in the place he tells you most sharply to leave alone. The loft was bitterly cold, and her breath smoked in the light of the single candle, and the shadows leaned and swung on the rough stone walls as she climbed the last of the stair and stood among the dead papers of the house. The iron-bound chest was where she remembered it, pushed back under the slope of the roof, behind a wall of bundled leases gone grey with dust, and it was locked. But she had spent 7 years with the keys of Edenfield Court on her own waist, and she knew the locks of the house as she knew its linen, and the third key she tried, a small old worn one she had never found a use for, and never thrown away, turned in it with a groan. She lifted the lid. There was not much in it. That was the first thing, and somehow the saddest, that a man should have been so frightened for 30 years of so little. There were a few bundles of old letters tied with faded tape. There was a small, flat, japanned box. There was an old leather letter book, its pages stiff with cold and disuse, and lying on top of everything, as though it had been the last thing put in and the lid shut quickly upon it, there was a folded paper, sealed across the fold with a red wax wafer pressed from a signet and written on its outer face, in old Sir Marcus's own cramped, frightened hand, 4 words, "To be burned unread." She knelt on the cold boards, and she did not burn it. She held it a long time in the candlelight, turning it, the dread and the hope going through her in slow, alternating waves like the cold. And then she set it carefully aside, because she had learned, in the muniment room with Mr. Quennell, that you do not read the conclusion until you have read the evidence. And she took up first the old letter book and opened it across her knees. It was a letter book of the brother Hugh's. She knew it within 3 pages, by the hand, which was a wild, handsome, careless hand, and by the matter, which was the matter of a young man in London going gaily to ruin. And she read, kneeling in the cold, the copied-out letters of a dead uncle she had never known she had. The begging letters to his hard elder brother, and the gay, defiant ones, and then, as the years in the book went on, the changed ones, the quieter ones, the ones written after the thing that had changed him, which was, she understood slowly, reading with her heart beginning to go very hard and slow, a marriage. He had married. The letter book held the draft of the letter in which he told his brother Marcus of it, and she read it twice, and then a third time, and the candle burned down a finger's width while she read it. He had married, secretly and for love and against every interest of his family. A young gentlewoman of good blood and no fortune, the orphan daughter of a clergyman, a Miss Eleanor Ashbourne, and the family had refused to own the marriage, because Hugh was meant to retrieve the Vane fortunes by marrying money, and had instead married a penniless parson's daughter for love. And old Sir Marcus, the head of the family, the hard, frightened, arithmetical brother, had cast Hugh off entire, had refused to receive the wife, had cut the allowance, in the cold certainty that to own such a marriage was to throw good money after a fool. And Hugh had died. The letter-book told it in the steward's hand at the end, a few dry lines, that Mr. Hugh Vane had died of a fever in his lodgings in the spring of the year 93, leaving a widow near her time, and that the widow, Mrs. Eleanor Vane, had been brought to bed of a daughter within the month, and had herself died of the childbed fever within the week, leaving the infant, the lawful child of the lawful marriage that the family would not own, alive and orphaned and inconvenient and cheap to be rid of. Thomasina knelt very still in the cold loft, with the letter-book open on her knees and the candle guttering, and she understood, with a slow, terrible completeness, what she was reading and whose story it was, and she did not weep, because she had taught herself 30 years ago not to weep on fine work, and the most finely worked thing she had ever held was the truth of her own life, laid open at last across her knees in a dead man's hand, and she made herself read on to the bottom, because the conclusion was not yet proved. She took up the bundles of letters then. They were the letters of the dead mother, Eleanor, the parson's orphan who had married for love and died of it. A little packet of them, written to Hugh in the brief, happy months of the marriage, and then, more terribly, 2 written after his death to old Sir Marcus himself, in a fine, failing hand, from a woman who knew she was dying, begging the hard brother not for herself, for she was past help, but for the child who was his own blood, his brother's lawful daughter, begging him to own her and rear her as a Vane, and not to let her grow up nameless. And across the second of these, in old Sir Marcus's cramped hand, was written a single docketing line, the line of a frightened arithmetical man settling a sum, refused, to be placed out at board, name not to be given. And Thomasina, holding the dying letters of the mother she had never known, the mother who had spent her last strength begging a hard man to give her daughter a name, felt the line on the far side of which she kept her whole self go, all at once, and quietly, like a thread cut. She did not break loudly. She was not a woman who could. She sat down on the cold floor among the dead papers with her back against the iron chest, and she pressed the little packet of her mother's letters to her face with both hands, and her shoulders shook, and she made no sound at all, and the candle burned down toward its socket, and she stayed so for a long time in the freezing dark of the loft over the old buttery, giving back to a woman 30 years dead the grief that had been owing to her all that while, the grief of a daughter for a mother who had loved her enough, dying to fight for her name, and had lost. And when at last the shaking passed and she could breathe again, she did the last thing, the thing she had set aside, the thing she had not let herself do until the evidence was read. She took up the folded paper, sealed with red wax, the one written over with "to be burned" unread, and she broke the seal of a dead man with her cold fingers, and she unfolded it, and she read, in old Sir Marcus's own frightened hand, the confession he had meant to be burned, and had not, after all, been able either to burn or to leave unwritten, which is the way of guilt in men too frightened to be either good or wholly wicked. It was short. It said that he, Marcus Vane, being now old and in fear of his account hereafter, set down for whatever conscience might do with it the truth that he had hidden, that the child placed out at board in the year 93, and after bound to the Lace at Norwich at his charge, and after that brought to Edenfield to keep the linen, was no foundling but the lawful daughter of his brother Hugh Vane and Hugh's lawful wife Eleanor, that he had hidden her birth and withheld her name out of pride, and out of the fear of the lawsuits and the claims that the owning of her would bring, that he had watched her grow under his own roof and keep his own books, and had never owned her, out of the same fear, grown by then into a habit he could not break, and that he repented of it, in so far as a frightened man can repent of a thing he is still too frightened to undo, and that the proofs of all of it, the marriage lines of Hugh and Eleanor and the baptism of the child, were not lost as he had let it be believed, but were in the flat, japanned box where he had kept them locked these 30 years against his own death, because even he, even Marcus Vane, had not in the end quite dared to destroy the only papers in the world that could give his brother's daughter back her name. Thomasina opened the flat, japanned box with her cold and shaking hands, and there, within, kept flat and sound these 30 years by the very miser who had hidden them, lay the proof in plain ink on good paper, the certificate of the marriage of Hugh Vane, gentleman, and Eleanor Ashbourne, spinster, solemnized before witnesses in a London parish in the year 92, and the certificate of the baptism in the same London parish of their daughter, born and christened in the spring of 93, given in the holy font, before God and witnesses, the name her dying mother had wished her to have, and her uncle had spent 30 years denying her, Thomasina Eleanor Vane, and folded with the certificates, in a twist of the same silver paper she had used all her life, kept by the dying mother and then by the hard uncle, and now come at last into the hands of the woman the child had become, was a single thing more, a thing that stopped Thomasina's heart in her breast and made the whole impossible circle close. A length of pricked parchment, a lace-maker's pattern, very old and very fine, the pattern of a christening cap, with a band worked round it in a device that was not quite ornament, the very pattern, stitch for stitch and curl for curl, that had come to her, she knew not how, in the Norwich workroom when she was a girl of 14, the pattern she had copied into the one beautiful thing she ever made and had never been able to read. And now, kneeling in the loft with the marriage lines and the baptism in her lap, she read it at last, the small repeated worked device in the band of her own christening cap, and saw that it was no ornament at all but letters. 3 letters, worked in thread by a mother for a daughter she would not live to name aloud, the initials that the parchment and the certificate and the dying letters all alike now spelled out plain, T-E-V, Thomasina Eleanor Vane. She had made, at 14, not knowing, copying a pattern sent into the world by a mother 30 years dead, the very monogram of her own true and lawful name, and she had carried it folded in silver paper at the bottom of her trunk through every grey year of her hidden life, the one thing she owned that she could not account for. And it had been, all along, the account itself, the entry that the linen book left out, the line that said who she was. She knelt a long time over it. The candle went out at last, and she did not light another. She did not need it. She knew every stitch of the thing in the dark by heart, had known it without knowing it for 14 years. And somewhere in that long, cold, dark hour, the last of the woman who had taught her grief to wait quietly, died, gently, and was not mourned. And in her place, there knelt on the cold boards of the loft a woman with a name, who gathered up very carefully into her grey apron the marriage lines and the baptism and the dying letters and the pricked parchment and the dead uncle's broken confession, the whole proven account of herself, and who rose, stiff with cold, and went down the narrow stair with her arms full of her own restored existence, to find the one living person in the world she could bear to show it to. The Earl of Harrogate was still up. She had known he would be. He slept badly. The leg and the eyes and whatever else the war had left in him kept him to the small hours, and there was a light under the door of the South Library and the smell of a low fire. She went in without knocking, which she had never once done, in her dusty grey gown with her hair greyed by the dust of the loft and her arms full of papers, and he looked up from the book he was not reading and saw her face, and he was on his feet at once, the stick forgotten, crossing to her with his uneven step, saying her name, which she realised she had never heard him say before. "Mrs. Vane, what is it? You are frozen? What has happened?" And she could not speak. She stood in the middle of the worn, warm room and held out to him in both her cold hands the whole proven account of herself, and could not for a moment say a single word. He made her sit. He put his own coat about her shoulders, scrupulous even now to do it without touching her, and he poured wine and made her drink it, and he sent the night porter to wake Mr. Quennell and to bring up old Pell, because she managed at last to say that they should be there, that it touched them all, that it must be read with witnesses, the way a true account is read. And when the old solicitor came down in his dressing gown, with his hair on end, and the old butler came in his nightshirt and breeches with a candle, the Earl cleared the long table, and Thomasina laid out upon it, in order, the way Mr. Quennell had taught her to lay out evidence, the whole of it. The brother Hugh's letter book open to the draft of the marriage letter, the dead mother Eleanor's letters, the happy ones and the two dying ones, with the hard brother's refusal docketed across the back, the marriage lines, the baptism with the name, the dead uncle's broken confession, written to be burned unread, and last, set a little apart, the length of pricked parchment with the worked initials, and beside it, taken now from the bottom of her trunk, where it had lain for 7 years, unwrapped at last from its silver paper in the candlelight, before them all, the small fine christening cap of point lace she had made at 14, the cap whose band she had now read. And the Earl of Harrogate stood at the head of the table in the ring of candlelight, with the deep shadow of the great cold room beyond, and he took up the dead uncle's confession in his scarred hands, and he broke nothing, for the seal was already broken. He simply read it aloud, slowly, in his low, level voice, the way he had read the line in the linen book, all the way to the bottom. And then he read aloud the marriage lines, and then the baptism, and when he came to the name written in the font, Thomasina Eleanor Vane, he stopped, and he looked up across the candlelight at the woman sitting wrapped in his coat with the dust of 30 years in her hair. And he read it again, the name, the second time not as evidence but as a thing said to her, the way her dying mother had wished it said, and no one in 28 years had ever said it. Thomasina Eleanor Vane. And old Pell put his candle down, because his hand was shaking too much to hold it, and the tears ran down the deep lines of his old face, unchecked, and he said, in a cracked whisper, "I knew it. God forgive me. I half knew it, and I held my tongue 30 years. And Mr. Quennell, the dry old lawyer who had seen everything, sat down rather suddenly in a chair and took off his spectacles and pressed his hand over his eyes, and then put them on again, and reached for the marriage lines with the steady greed of a man who has just been handed the one true document in a false case, and began at once, even in that hour, to read it for the law. and Thomasina sat very still in the Earl's coat in the candlelight and heard her own name read aloud over the proofs of it by the man who had refused to let her be tidied away, and felt the grief and the hope and the 30 years all come up together and break over her at last, like a sea coming over a wall, quietly, without a sound, only the tears running down her composed oval face faster than she could have stopped them if she had tried, and she did not try. Mr. Quennell worked through the rest of that night and would not be sent to bed. He had the documents and he went over them, as a hound goes over a scent, and by the grey of the morning he had it laid out cold and clear, and he gave it to the Earl and to Thomasina across the breakfast they none of them ate. The case, he said, was as strong as any he had handled in 35 years, and as ugly. Strong, because the proofs were genuine. He had no doubt of it. The hands matched, the seals were sound, the parish entries could be confirmed by the registers in London within the fortnight. Thomasina Eleanor Vane was beyond any reasonable doubt a court would entertain, the lawful and only child of Hugh Vane and Eleanor his wife. And as such, he said, looking at her steadily over his spectacles, she stood in the strict settlement of the Edenfield estate, a great deal nearer to the property than anyone had supposed, for she was the lawful issue of the elder of the 2 younger brothers, and Mr. Roderick Vane's whole claim rested on being the issue of— The old lawyer paused, and his dry voice went very flat, the issue of the younger. And that was the ugliness of it, and the danger. For Mr. Caudle and his client had come into this house playing the one card that the truth, once known, would knock clean out of their hand. They had come to cry her down as a base-born impostor precisely because, if she were ever proved Hugh's lawful daughter, Mr. Roderick's claim was not merely weakened, it was ruined, and a man who has built a fraud upon the certainty that a hidden truth will stay hidden does not, when the truth walks into the light, pack his bags and go quietly home. He fights the harder, and he fights the dirtier, because he has now everything to lose, and the dirtiest weapon left to a man in Mr. Caudle's position, the old lawyer said, was no longer the law, where he was now beaten, but the world, the drawing-rooms, the slow poisonous talk, the scandal of a base-born lace-maker got up by a dead miser to seize a great estate, a story so much more agreeable to repeat than the dull true one that it would run through the county and up to London and be believed by people who would never trouble to read a marriage line, long after every court in England had ruled the other way. He cannot win the case now, my lord, Mr. Quennell said, folding his spectacles, but he can still win the world if we let him, and he can poison Mrs. Vane's name, past curing even in victory, so that she is the woman who was proved a Vane in law and called an impostor at every tea-table in Norfolk for the rest of her life. That is what he will try for now. And against that, my lord, the law is no use to us at all. Against that we need someone who can carry the true story into the world faster and surer than he can carry the false one, and carry it with a name and a face the drawing-rooms cannot sneer at. And the Earl of Harrogate, who had sat through all of this very still, listening to the bottom of it as he listened to everything, was quiet a moment, and then he set down his cup, and a thing came into his level, scarred face that Thomasina had not seen there before. Something almost like the ghost of a grim amusement, and he said, "Then it is fortunate that I have an aunt." It was, he explained, the Dowager Countess of Harrogate, his mother's sister, his aunt by marriage and by long affection both, a formidable, upright old woman of near 70, who had ruled a wing of London society for 40 years, with a tongue like a clean blade and a reputation so unassailable that she had long since stopped troubling to defend it and spent it, instead, on others. A woman, the Earl said, who had taken him in at 13, when he was the inconvenient, cheap-to-be-rid-of younger son packed off to sea, and had written to him in every port for 15 years, and was the one person living to whom he owed it that he had not become, somewhere in those years, a man with nothing under the stillness but cold. "She is bored," the Earl said simply, "and she loves a true thing, and she despises a cheat, and there is no woman in England who can carry a story through a drawing-room as she can. If I write to her tonight and lay the whole of it before her, the proofs and the fraud and Mr. Caudle and all, she will be at Edenfield within the week with her own horses, and after that, Mr. Quennell, I think we need not greatly fear the tea-tables of Norfolk." And so the letter was written, and went south by the fast post. And in the meantime, the household of Edenfield Court changed, all at once and without anything being said, in the way it held the woman who had kept it. Old Pell, who had wept over her name in the night, would now scarcely let her carry so much as a candle, and went about the house with a kind of fierce, trembling reverence, calling her, when he forgot himself, Miss Thomasina, the way he might have called the daughter of the house 30 years ago if the daughter of the house had been let to grow up in it. And the maids whispered and stared and bobbed, and Mr. Quennell treated her with the grave courtesy he would have shown any lady whose case he had the honour to conduct. And only the Earl of Harrogate treated her, in the main, exactly as he had before, with the same grave, level, scrupulous attention, except that now, sometimes when she came into a room, she caught on his face before he could level it away a look of such plain, undefended gladness that she had to drop her eyes. For it was one thing, she found, to be owned by the law and the household as a vain, and quite another, and far more terrifying, to be looked at across a breakfast table by a quiet wounded man, as though her merely being alive and in the room were the best piece of news he had had in 15 years. They did not speak of it. There was the case, and the coming of the aunt, and Mr. Caudle still smiling and dangerous at the inn, and 100 proper reasons not to speak of it, and there was, under all the proper reasons, the one true reason, which was that Thomasina Eleanor Vane, who had just learned at 28 that she had a name and a mother who had loved her, and a father who had married for that mother's sake against all the world, did not yet dare to learn, on top of all the rest, in one short autumn, that she might also be allowed to be loved. For the heart, she was discovering, could be given back its losses only so fast, and she had 30 years of them coming home all at once, and she needed, for a little while yet, to keep at least the last and the dearest of her wantings on the far side of its line, where it could not break her before she was strong enough to bear the breaking. The Dowager Countess of Harrogate came, as her nephew had promised, within the week, in her own travelling coach, with her own horses and her own maid, and an air of having decided to be amused, and she was everything he had said, and a great deal more. She was tall and upright, and near 70, with silver hair dressed high and shrewd, amused eyes, in a handsome, lined, aristocratic face, and she came into the cold hall of Edenfield in a rich, dark plum gown with fine old lace at the high collar and cuffs, and she looked about her once at the great grey house with the eye of a general surveying a field, and then she looked at Thomasina, who had come down to receive her, not knowing how to receive her, in the best of her 2 grey gowns, with her hands folded. And the old lady looked at her a long moment, slowly, from the plainly pinned chestnut hair to the work-worn hands, and Thomasina stood and let herself be looked at, having long practice in it, and then the Dowager Countess said, in a clear, carrying drawing-room voice that was pitched, Thomasina understood at once, to be overheard by every servant in the hall, and repeated in every kitchen in the county. "So, you are Hugh Vane's girl. I knew your father a little before he disgraced himself by marrying for love, which was the one wholly creditable thing he ever did, and which this family has spent 30 years pretending to be ashamed of. You have his brow, and you have, unless I am much mistaken, your mother's chin, For I knew the Ashbournes too, and they were better blood than the Vanes ever were, only poorer, which in this country is the only sin that is never forgiven. Come here, child, and let me look at you in the light. I am told you make lace. I am told. And here the old voice sharpened to its clean blade and lifted a little more, for the benefit of the listening house, and, beyond it, the listening county. I am told there is a person at the village inn who has been saying you are a base-born impostor. We shall attend to him. But first you shall give me some tea, for I have come a very long way to acknowledge my great-nephew's cousin, and I find I am extremely pleased to do it. And that, in effect, was the battle won, though the fighting of it took another fortnight. For the Dowager Countess of Harrogate did with the true story exactly what Mr. Quennell had said was needed, and what no court could do. She carried it. She had only to be seen to receive Thomasina as a Vane, to walk into the village church on the Sunday with Thomasina beside her, and seat her in the great pew, to speak of my young cousin, Miss Vane, in that clear, unanswerable voice, to the rector and the rector's wife and the 2 county families who called, and the thing was done. For a story is believed not according to its truth, but according to the credit of its teller. And there was no one in Norfolk with the standing to contradict the Countess of Harrogate, and no one foolish enough to try. The slow, poisonous talk that Mr. Caudle had been so carefully sowing found, all at once, that it had nowhere to grow. For you cannot whisper that a woman is a base-born fraud after the Dowager Countess has publicly called her cousin, without whispering in the same breath that the Dowager Countess is either a fool or a liar, and no one in the county believed her to be either. Mr. Septimus Caudle felt the ground go out from under him, and being a clever man, he understood quickly that he had lost, and being a dishonest one he made, before he went, one last attempt to turn his losing into money, which was the only language he truly spoke. He came up to the house, smiling still but with the smile gone tight, and asked to see the Earl, and was shown, to his evident dismay, not into a private room, but into the great hall itself, where the Earl of Harrogate stood waiting for him with Mr. Quennell at his side, and the Dowager Countess seated in a great chair by the fire, with her work in her hands, and Thomasina standing quietly near her. For the Earl had arranged it so, deliberately, that whatever Mr. Caudle had come to say, he should say it before witnesses, in the open, in the cold, grand hall, where the painted dead Vanes looked down, with no shadows to do business in. And Mr. Caudle, thus stripped of his confidential corners, made the best of it. He had reflected, he said, smiling and rubbing his soft hands. He had looked again, in a spirit of fairness, at the proofs his lordship had been so good as to communicate, and he was bound to say, as an honest man, that there appeared to be, he would not deny it, some substance to the lady's claim of relationship, some colour of right. And in that altered case, his client, Mr. Roderick Vane, who desired above all things, he said, the peace and honour of the family, would be willing, most willing, to withdraw his own claim entirely, to retire, to trouble the family no further, in consideration only his lordship would understand of some modest, some quite reasonable, some merely face-saving settlement, a few thousands, a trifle to an estate like Edenfield, to cover his client's expenses and his disappointment, and to ensure, Mr. Caudle said, the smile stretching, that nothing further of an awkward nature should ever be said, in any quarter, touching the lady's birth or the late Sir Marcus's conduct. For these things, once started, his lordship would appreciate, were so very difficult to stop, and a man of Mr. Caudle's wide acquaintance had it so very much in his power either to lay such talk to rest or, regrettably, to find it spreading beyond all checking. It was, naked at last, the threat under the smile. Pay me, or I will sell your wife's name in every drawing-room in London. And the hall was very quiet when he had finished. And the Earl of Harrogate looked at him for a long moment with his level grey-blue eyes, and did not raise his voice, and said, "Mr. Caudle, you have just, before these witnesses, offered to withdraw a claim you now admit to be false in exchange for money, and threatened, if the money is not paid, to defame a lady whose birth you now admit to be lawful. Mr. Quennell, I believe there is a name in law for what we have just heard." And Mr. Quennell, dry as dust, said that there was indeed, my lord, more than one, and that he had been at some pains to write down Mr. Caudle's words as he spoke them, having anticipated their general tenor, and that he would be happy to read them back. And the Dowager Countess, from her chair by the fire, not looking up from her work, said in her clear, amused, deadly voice, "And you may add, Mr. Quennell, that I shall myself be in London by the first week of December, where I dine, as it happens, with the Lord Chancellor's sister on the 9th, and that I shall be most happy to give him, and her, and indeed anyone else who cares to hear it, a full and particular account of the conduct of a Lincoln's Inn attorney named Septimus Caudle in the matter of the Vane estate, for I find, at my age, that I have time for very little, but I always have time to be of use to the friends of an honest cause. Do I make myself understood, sir, or shall I be plainer? I assure you I can be a great deal plainer. It is the chief pleasure left to me." And Mr. Septimus Caudle looked round the cold grand hall, at the level implacable Earl, and the dry lawyer with the written words, and the terrible amused old countess with her clean blade of a voice, and the quiet grey woman who was no longer a thing in a linen book, but a Vane acknowledged and defended and beloved. And he understood, finally and completely, that he had not merely lost, but had walked, with all his cleverness, into the one position in which his every weapon could be turned against him, and the smile went off his large soft face like water off a stone, and he gathered up his dignity such as it was, and he bowed, stiffly, and he said that there had plainly been a misunderstanding, that he had been misinformed by his client, that he would of course advise Mr. Roderick to withdraw at once and entirely, with no settlement of any kind, and that he begged his lordship's pardon and the lady's for any distress occasioned, and he backed out of the hall of Edenfield Court, smiling again now but sickly, and got into his hired chaise, and was driven away down the long avenue under the bare, dripping trees, and was not seen in Norfolk again. And Mr. Roderick Vane, the false claimant, who had built a year's patient fraud upon the certainty that a hidden truth would stay hidden, vanished back into the London obscurity he had come from, and troubled the family no more, having gained by the whole business precisely nothing, which was, as the Dowager Countess observed with satisfaction over her tea, a great deal less than he deserved, and exactly as much as he was likely to get. So the danger passed. The case, in the cold language of the law, was settled within the season. The registers in London confirmed the marriage and the baptism. The proofs were lodged and recorded, and Thomasina Eleanor Vane was, by every measure the world used, no longer a foundling kept on charity, but a gentlewoman of the Vane blood, the lawful daughter of Hugh Vane, with a standing in the strict settlement of the Edenfield estate, that Mr. Quennell, after much grave consultation of the deeds, pronounced to be very considerable indeed, considerable enough that there was a real and serious question, which his lordship the Earl must decide, of how much of Edenfield was, in strict justice, hers. And it was here, with the danger gone and the world set right and her name restored and her enemies fled, that Thomasina Eleanor Vane came up at last against the hardest reckoning of all, the one no document could settle and no countess could carry through a drawing-room, which was that she did not know, after 30 years of wanting nothing, how to want the one thing that was now, impossibly, within her reach. For she had built herself, stone by careful stone, into a woman who asked for nothing, and the building had kept her alive. And now the world was asking her to unbuild it, to put out her hand and take a name, an inheritance, a place at the table, and beyond all these, the thing she did not even let herself look at directly. The grave, wounded gladness on the face of the man who had refused to let her be tidied away. And she found that she could take the name with grief and gratitude because it was given her by the dead. And she could be brought slowly to take her place at the table because the living was so determined she should. But the last thing, the dearest and most terrifying thing, the thing that would mean letting her whole long-guarded heart come up at last from the far side of its line and stand in the open where it could be broken, that she did not know how to take. And she was half afraid that she had taught herself too well, too young, for too long, ever to learn. The Earl of Harrogate, for his part, did the one thing that, of all things, made it hardest for her and easiest at once. He did not press. He could have pressed. He had every worldly reason to. A marriage between them would have settled at a stroke the awkward question of how much of Edenfield was hers, for what was hers would then be theirs, and the lawyers would have been glad of it, and the world would have thought it sensible. And he was a man not insensible, she knew, to how convenient and how just, and how very much desired such a settlement would be. And he never once said so. He behaved instead with a delicacy that wrung her heart, precisely because she understood what it cost him. He set the whole question of the property before her, plainly through Mr. Quennell, told her what was justly hers, and pressed her to take all of it, and made it as clear as a scrupulous man could make it without saying the words that whatever she decided about Edenfield, she should decide as a free woman with a fortune of her own, and not as a poor relation with no choice. For he would not, he told Mr. Quennell, and Mr. Quennell, who had grown fond of them both, told her, have it ever said, or ever thought, least of all by herself, that she had come to him for want of bread or roof. If she came to him at all, she must come from a position where she could as easily have walked away. He was, in short, determined to make her rich and independent and entirely free to refuse him before he would let himself so much as ask. And there was no kindness he could have done her that would have undone her more completely, for she had spent her whole life among people who kept her precisely because she could not walk away, and here at last was a man labouring to give her the power to leave him, for no reason on earth but that he could not bear to have her stay on any terms but freedom. And so the autumn deepened toward winter, and the matter hung between them, unspoken and understood, while the lawyers did their work, and the Dowager Countess, who saw everything and approved of most of it, stayed on at Edenfield far longer than she had meant to, ostensibly to lend Thomasina countenance with the county, and in truth, Thomasina came to see, to be present for a thing she was quite sure was coming and had no intention of missing. And the evenings in the South Library went on, the reading aloud by the fire with the maid in the corner, except that now Thomasina sat, by the Countess's clear command, not at the far corner of the table, like a servant, but in the good chair by the hearth, like a lady, and the Earl, across the fire, listened to her read with his eyes closed and his scarred hands still, and the firelight lay on both their faces. And the thing that neither of them said grew larger and warmer and more impossible to ignore with every quiet evening that passed. It was the Dowager Countess who, in the end, forced the matter in her own fashion, which was to refuse to force it and to make her refusal unbearable. She announced one morning at breakfast, looking with bland innocence from her nephew to Thomasina and back, that she had stayed quite long enough, that an old woman had affairs in London, that she would leave on the Thursday. And then she added, buttering her toast, that she supposed she should be sorry to go, for she had grown used to the comfort of the house, by which she meant, she said, looking directly at the Earl now over her spectacles, the comfort of seeing two people she was fond of make each other a very little less lonely, and that she did hope, when she came again in the spring, to find that the arrangement had been, she would say, regularized, for she was too old to enjoy a thing that pretended to be other than it was, and she found she had no patience left for two grown people sitting on opposite sides of a fire, each waiting for the other to be the first to admit to being warm. And she finished her toast, and rose, and went out, leaving the two of them alone in the breakfast room with the wreck of her plainness lying on the table between them. And the maid had not yet come in, and for the length of a long moment, neither of them could look at the other. It was the Earl of Harrogate who broke it, that evening, in the South Library, in the firelight, and he did it, characteristically, by making it as safe for her as he possibly could, and asking it, in the end, as plainly as her own dying mother had begged for her name. He waited until she had finished the chapter she was reading. He waited until she had closed the book. And then he said, into the quiet, not moving from his chair, keeping his voice low and level so that she should not be startled, with the maid still sitting in the corner at her sewing, because he would not even now compromise her by sending the girl away. Mrs. Vane, I must ask you something. And I must ask it badly, because I have had no practice at it, and because the only other time in my life I tried to say a thing of this kind, the lady very reasonably married a richer man, and I have been at sea or at war ever since, and have grown out of the way of it. So you must forgive the plainness. I am not a man who can do it any other way. And he turned in his chair and looked at her across the fire, and the careful level stillness was gone from his face entirely now, put off deliberately, like a man laying down a weapon to show his hands are empty, and what was underneath was naked and grave and frightened and steady all at once. When I came to this house, he said, I came to take possession of everything that was in it. That was the phrase in the lawyer's letter. I remember thinking it an ugly phrase, even then, before I knew there was anyone in the house for it to be ugly about. And then I found you, written into the linen book between the napkins and the lace, no wage, as though you were one of the things I had come to take possession of. And I have spent every day since being more ashamed of that phrase, and of the whole world that made it, and of every comfortable man who ever found it convenient to write a living person down among his goods. I do not want to take possession of you. I have watched men take possession of people all my life, and it is the ugliest thing I know. I want the opposite of that. I want, if you will permit me, to spend the rest of my life making quite sure that you are never again counted as a thing in anyone's book, including mine. I have made you, as far as the law can do it, rich and free, and able to leave this house tomorrow, and never look back, precisely so that I might ask you this with clean hands. I am asking you to marry me, not for Edenfield, which is yours by right, whether you have me or no. Not because it would be convenient, though God knows it would. I am asking you because in 15 years of a cold life, you are the first warm thing I have not had to test with the back of my hand to believe in, and because the best hour of my whole day, every day, for 2 months, has been the hour you sit by that fire and read to me in your quiet voice, as though such a thing were ordinary. And I find I cannot any longer bear to think of a single evening of the rest of my life in which that hour does not come. That is the whole of it. You may take as long as you like to answer, and any answer you give will be honoured. And if it is no, I will see you settled and independent, and I will not trouble you again, and we will neither of us ever speak of it. But I had to ask you plainly once, in words, because you have spent your whole life being given things sideways and taken sideways and written down sideways, and you deserve, at least once, to be asked a thing straight out, to your face, as a person, by someone who means every word of it, So, will you have me, Thomasina?" And Thomasina Eleanor Vane sat very still in the good chair by the fire with the closed book in her lap and the firelight on her face. And she felt the line on the far side of which she had kept her whole heart for 30 years. The line she had drawn at 14 over a piece of fine work and held against grief and against hope and against every kindness the world had ever tried on her. She felt it go at last, not cut this time, but simply, quietly, no longer needed, dissolving the way frost dissolves off a window when at last a fire is lit in the room. And all the wanting she had filed flat and folded small and kept under everything for 30 years came up at once and stood in the open, in the firelight, unhidden, where it could be seen and where it could be broken. And she found, to her own astonishment, that she was not afraid of the breaking any longer, because the man across the fire had spent 2 months and a fortune and all his guarded heart making her a place to stand where breaking could not destroy her. She did not answer at once. She could not. Her throat had closed. She looked at him, and the tears stood in her grey eyes and did not fall, the way they had not fallen over the linen book, except that these were not the tears she had taught to wait, but a different kind entirely. And she let him see them, which was itself an answer, the first wholly unguarded thing she had let her face do in front of another soul in 30 years. And then she found her voice, low and not quite steady, the even, unflourished voice that had read him 100 chapters. And she said the thing she had never in her life imagined she would be free to say. "My lord," she said, "I have spent my whole life learning not to want anything, because everything I ever wanted was a thing I was not allowed to have, and it was easier to stop the wanting at the root than to bear the not having. I taught myself so well that I thought it had gone for good. I thought I was a field after the harvest, with nothing left in me to want until a spring that was never going to come." She stopped and steadied herself, and went on. "I do not want Edenfield, my lord. I am glad of my name, for my mother died begging for it, and I will carry it for her sake all my days. But I have kept this house 7 years, and it has never once felt like mine, and I do not think a house ever will. I find," and here her voice broke, just a little, and she let it, "I find that the only thing in all of it that I want, that I have wanted since the evening you read my own life aloud to me out of a linen book and were ashamed for me when I had long ago stopped being able to be ashamed for myself, the only thing I want is the asking. Not the inheritance, the asking. To be a person someone asks, I did not know until you asked me just now, straight out, to my face, as you said, like a person, that being asked was the thing I had wanted all along and never once had. So, yes." She drew a breath, and the tears came down at last, freely, the long-deferred grief and the new impossible joy together, and she did not stop them. "Yes, I will have you. Not for the house and not for safety, and not because I cannot walk away, for you have taken great care that I can. I will have you because you are the first person in 28 years who looked at the place where I had written myself down as nothing and refused, absolutely refused, to read it the way it was written. Yes, with my whole heart, which I find after all this time is still there, and still mine to give, and still, God help me, warm. Yes." And the maid in the corner had stopped even pretending to sew, and was weeping quietly into the work in her lap. And the Earl of Harrogate rose from his chair, stiffly, favouring the leg, and crossed the small space of firelit floor between them that had taken him 2 months and the whole of his courage to cross, and he did not seize her or sweep her up, for he was not that kind of man, and she was not that kind of woman. He simply stood before her and took both her work-worn hands in his 2 scarred ones, very gently, as though they were the finest lace in the house and might tear, and he bowed his dark head over them, and Thomasina felt his shoulders shake, once, the shaking of a man who has held himself level for 15 years and need not, any longer, hold himself level at all. And she freed one hand and laid it on his bent head, on the dark hair going grey before its time, the way a woman lays her hand on something she means to keep. And the fire burned warm in the worn south library where she had read to him all the long grey-gold autumn, and outside the lozenged windows the first snow of the Norfolk winter began, very softly, to fall. They were married in the spring, in the small grey stone parish church in the village below Edenfield, where the dead Vanes lay under their stone, and where, by a turn that Thomasina felt as the closing of a great slow circle, the register that would record her marriage was the very register kept by the very church to which 30 years before an unwanted infant had been brought in the night and not christened, because the man who had charge of her had forbidden her name to be given. For that was the last of the wrongs to be set right, and the one that meant the most to her, more even than the marriage, though she did not say so to anyone but the rector. She had gone to him quietly, some weeks before the wedding, with the London certificate of her true baptism in her hand, the one her uncle had hidden for 30 years, that recorded her christening in a London parish in the spring of '93 under the name her mother chose. And she had asked him, not as the bride of the Earl of Harrogate, but simply as Thomasina Eleanor Vane, whether the register of his own parish, the parish of the house where she had been hidden, might be set right. For there was in it, she knew, having kept every book in the neighbourhood at one time or another, an old entry from that spring, a bare grim line recording the reception into the parish of the poor of a female child, base-born, name unknown, placed at board by direction. And she asked the rector whether, the truth being now proven and recorded, that old cruel line might be amended, so that the child who had been entered into the world of that parish as base-born and nameless might be entered also, now, fairly, as who she truly was. And the rector, a kind, plain young man, much moved by the whole story, had taken his pen, and beneath the old grim line which he would not erase, for a register is a record, and the truth includes the lie that was told, had written in fresh ink the correction, that the child entered above as base-born and of unknown name was since proven to be Thomasina Eleanor Vane, lawful daughter of Hugh Vane, gentleman, and Eleanor his wife, born and baptized in London in that same year, the error of this register being here corrected in the year 1822, by the testimony of the said child, now grown. And Thomasina had stood at the lectern and watched the fresh ink dry beneath the old, and had laid her hand flat on the open page for a moment, the way she laid her hand on things she meant to keep, and had felt, she said afterward to her husband, that whole grey life close gently over and be at peace, the way a wound closes when at last the splinter is drawn. So she was married out of a church that had at last written her name. She wore no grand gown, she would not. She wore a simple, elegant, pale, high-necked gown that she made over herself with her own hands, the one extravagance being the lace at the collar and the cuffs, which was the old Edenfield lace from the cedar chest, the Brussels point, and the Mechlin she had counted and watched over and mended for 7 years, given to her now to wear because, as the Dowager Countess observed, it was absurd that the woman who had kept that lace alive should be the only woman in the county never to have worn it. And she carried, in place of flowers, her mother's worn, soft Bible, and tucked into the Bible, where she could feel it through the cover under her hand, all through the service, the small, fine christening cap of point lace she had made at 14, the cap whose worked band spelled her own true name, the one thing she had carried unexplained through all the grey years and could now, at last, account for. Old Pell, who had wept over her name in the night and called her Miss Thomasina ever after, gave her away, for there was no one with a better right, he having been the only soul at Edenfield who had half known the truth and grieved over it for 30 years, and he did it with the tears running unchecked down the deep lines of his old face, and his hand trembling on her arm. The proudest and the most broken-hearted man in Norfolk. The Dowager Countess of Harrogate sat in the great pew in her plum silk and her fine old lace, and wept exactly twice, briefly and angrily, as though tears were an indulgence she permitted herself only under protest, and dared anyone to remark on it. Mr. Quennell, the dry old lawyer, stood at the back and thought, he confessed afterward, of nothing in particular except that it was the only case in 35 years that had ended exactly as it ought, which was so rare a thing in the law that he found he could not quite keep his own face in order. And the Earl of Harrogate, standing at the chancel step in a fine dark blue coat, with his bad leg braced and his scarred face, for once making no effort at all to be level, took the 2 work-worn hands of Thomasina Eleanor Vane into his 2 scarred ones and married her. And his low-worn voice did not shake until he came to the words, "With all my worldly goods I thee endow," at which it shook very much, for they both of them knew. And the Dowager Countess in the front pew knew, and Mr. Quennell at the back knew, what those words meant in the mouth of a man who had found her written down among another man's worldly goods, no wage, and had refused with his whole soul to read her so. They did not speak much of old Sir Marcus afterward, the frightened arithmetical man who had hidden her and watched her keep his books, and never once owned her, and who had died with 2 words on his lips, a name and the word sorry, that Thomasina had not understood at the time, and understood now to have been her mother's name, Eleanor, and the apology of a dying man to the woman whose daughter he had wronged. She found, when she looked into herself for it, that she could not hate him, though she had every right, for she had read his broken confession, the one marked to be burned unread that he had been unable either to burn or to leave unwritten, and she knew that he had carried his guilt locked in an iron chest for 30 years, and that he had kept the proofs of her birth when it would have been so much safer to destroy them, kept them against his own death, because even he could not, in the end, quite bring himself to make her loss final. And she came to think of him not as a wicked man, but as a frightened one, a man so afraid of being cheated that he had cheated a child of her whole life and called it prudence, and had known it, at the last, for what it was. And so she did the thing that she found, somewhat to her own surprise, she wished to do. She forgave him. She had a small stone set in the church, near the Vane stone, not for him, but for the 2 he had wronged, for Hugh and Eleanor, the father and mother she had never known, who had married for love against all the world and died of it and left a daughter they were not allowed to name, and she had cut into it after their names, a line of her own choosing, that they were here remembered at last by their daughter. And standing before it on a soft spring morning with her husband beside her, she found that the forgiving of the old man came of itself, quietly, as a thing no longer worth the carrying, and she set it down, the way she had set down so much, except that this she set down not on the far side of any line but simply on the ground, finished and walked away from it lighter. The christening cap she kept. She wrapped it again in fresh silver paper, but she did not put it at the bottom of any trunk. She laid it in the cedar chest on the upper landing among the Edenfield lace she had spent 7 years keeping, the Brussels point and the Mechlin and the old Honiton, where it belonged now, an heirloom of the house and no longer a secret. And she entered it, in the long linen book, in her own small even hand, on a fresh page, in a new line that gave her a strange, deep, private joy to write, for it was the answer at last to the line she had written every Michaelmas for 7 years. Item, 1 christening cap of point lace, the work of the daughter of the house, kept against the christening of her children. And in the fullness of time there was a child to christen, a daughter, born at Edenfield in the second winter of the marriage, in a house that was warm now in all its rooms and full of people and no longer afraid. And the child was christened in the same grey church whose register had been set right, under a name that the Dowager Countess pronounced entirely satisfactory, and she wore at her christening the small fine cap of point lace her mother had made at 14, the cap whose worked band spelled a name, worn now by a child who would never in her life have to wonder what her own name was, or whether she had a right to it. And Thomasina, watching her husband hold their daughter at the font with his scarred, careful hands, his level face wholly undone with a gladness he no longer made any attempt to hide, understood that the long account was closed at last, and had, against every probability, against 30 years of evidence to the contrary, come right. And so it was that the woman who had taught her grief to wait on the far side of a line, and had written herself into a great house's linen book between the napkins and the lace as one widow, taken in upon charity, no wage, her board and a garret and the mending of her own 2 gowns, when she could find the hours, the woman whom a comfortable frightened man had hidden, and a cruel clever one had tried to cry down as nothing, and a whole world had found it convenient to read as a thing that was merely in the house, became, by the patient, steady, undefended asking of the one man who had looked at the place where she had written herself as nothing, and refused absolutely to read it the way it was written, the Countess of Harrogate and the mistress of Edenfield Court, and, dearer to her than either and dearer than the name itself, the wife who was asked, and the mother who could give her own daughter, freely and at the font and in the open before God and the whole forgiven world, the one thing her own dying mother had begged a hard man for on her knees in 2 failing letters 30 years before and not been given, and that Thomasina had carried all unknowing in a worked band of lace at the bottom of a trunk through every grey, unwanted year, until a stranger in a plain dark coat turned it to the light and read it true. A name, freely given, and the certain unhidden knowledge, written now in fresh ink beneath every old grim line that had ever said otherwise, of being wanted and counted and kept.